Exiled at 16 for lying about the fuel shortage, she built a buried wood pantry. Jonas Hegland, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried a son to the cold, told her, "When the drifts seal your door, you will freeze first and lie second." She had $13, no family, and no way to cut 6 cords before winter. On November 9th, 1886, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Marit Solheim had never stacked a cord of firewood in her life. She had arrived at the claim 4 months before winter with a dead father, a debt notice, and hands that had never held an axe for longer than an hour. The wagon that brought Marit Solheim from the burial site stopped at the edge of her father's property on a July afternoon, so hot the grasshoppers fell silent. The driver would not take her further. The ruts had gone to dust, and he had freight to move before dark. He lifted her trunk to the ground, nodded once, and turned the team back toward Medora. Marit stood in the heat and looked at what her father had left her. The cabin sat on a shallow rise above the bottomlands, where the Little Missouri cut through broken country, 12 feet by 16, plank walls. Sod banked against the base where Peter Solheim had tried to seal the drafts he never finished sealing. One window, its oiled paper already splitting at the corner. A door that hung crooked because the upper hinge had pulled loose from the frame. She crossed the dry grass and pushed the door open. It scraped against the floor and stuck. She pushed harder. Inside, the air tasted of dust and old smoke. The stove sat cold in the corner, its pipe climbing through the roof at an angle that looked wrong. A rope bed frame with no mattress. A table her father had built from cottonwood planks, one leg shimmed with a folded scrap of leather. On the table sat a tin cup, a spoon, and a letter. The letter was from Elias Rook. It stated that Peter Solheim owed $41.70 for goods advanced on credit, and that the note would come due at first frost. If payment was not received, Mr. Rook would exercise his legal right to seize the property and its improvements. Marit read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. She walked outside and found the woodpile. It sat uncovered behind the cabin, exposed to the sun and the rain and whatever else the sky had sent since her father stopped being able to work. 1.5 cords at most, and even that was generous counting. The outer logs had gone dark with moisture, their bark soft and peeling. She pressed her thumb into the end grain of one piece. It sank in. The wood had started to rot. This was what she had: 1.5 cords of softening cottonwood, an unfinished cabin, $41 in debt, and $13 in coin that her father had sewn into the lining of his coat before he died. $13. A dull crosscut saw with 2 missing teeth, a maul with a cracked handle wrapped in rawhide, 2 hens that had survived by eating grasshoppers, no horse, no oxen, no wagon, no brothers, no husband. And winter was coming. The men at the freight yard heard about her before she ever walked into town. Word traveled fast in country this empty. A girl alone on the Solheim claim. 16 years old. Father dead of fever after a wagon crushed his leg and the wound went bad. No family coming west to collect her. No passage money to go east. They talked about it the way men talk about weather or cattle, something to fill the silence between loads. Jonas Hegland heard about her on a Tuesday and rode out on a Wednesday. He told himself he was checking the lower ford, but the ford was 2 miles past the Solheim claim, and he could have reached it without passing her door. He was a freight hauler, 58 years old, with a face carved by 11 Dakota winters and hands that had loaded every kind of cargo the territory demanded. He had buried a son in the winter of '80 and buried a partner in the winter of '83. He knew what this country did to people who were not ready. He found the girl stacking rotten wood. She was pulling pieces from the pile and sorting them, the worst to one side, the less worse to another. Her sleeves were rolled up and her arms were streaked with grime. She did not stop working when she heard his horse. Hegland dismounted and stood at the edge of the property. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the girl. "You are Solheim's daughter," he said. Yes. "How much wood have you got?" She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. 1.5 cords, maybe less if the rot goes deeper than I think. You need 6 to survive a Dakota winter, maybe 7 if the cabin leaks like I expect it does. I know. Do you? It was not a question. Heglin walked closer and examined the stack. He picked up a piece and smelled it, then dropped it back on the pile. This is not firewood. This is tinder that will burn too fast and smoke too much. Half of it will crumble before first snow. Then I will cut more. With what team? I have no team. With what wagon? I have no wagon. From what timber? Marit pointed toward the bottomlands. There is cottonwood along the river, deadfall, some standing dead from the last high water. Heglin laughed. It was not a kind laugh. Cottonwood is soft. It burns fast. You would need to haul twice the weight of good hardwood, and you have no way to haul anything. You have no way to cut it properly. You have no way to season it. You have no way to keep it dry. I will find a way. You will not. He walked to the cabin and looked at the roof, the walls, the gap where the sod banking had pulled away from the planks. He looked at the crooked door and the splitting window paper. He looked at the stovepipe and shook his head. Your father was a good man, Heglin said. He was not a builder. This cabin will leak heat like a sieve leaks water. You will burn fuel faster than any reasonable estimate. And when the real cold comes, not the first freeze, not the light snow, but the deep cold that locks the world, you will run out. You do not know that. I know this territory. I have hauled freight through 11 winters. I have seen men with teams and tools and years of experience run out of wood and burn their furniture. I have seen families kill their horses for the heat of the blood. I have seen children. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I have seen enough, he said. Marit did not look away from him. What do you suggest I do? Walk away, sell what you can carry, take the stage east, find family, find work, find a husband, find anything except a frozen death on a claim that your father could not finish and you cannot hold. I cannot leave. Why? I owe Elias Rook $41. If I leave, he takes everything. My father's tools, my father's cabin, my father's land, everything he worked for. Your father is dead. He does not care. I care. Heglin studied her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked to his horse. When the drifts seal your door, he said, you will freeze first. Then you will have plenty of time to lie about how it happened. No one will hear you anyway. He mounted and rode north toward the ford. Marit watched him go. Then she went back to sorting the rotting wood. The next week, she tried to warn them. She walked into Medora on a Thursday morning with blisters on both palms and a calculation in her head that she had worked through 6 different ways. She had counted her wood. She had measured her cabin. She had estimated her stove's appetite based on how fast her father had burned through supplies the previous winter before he got sick. She had looked at the sky and felt the morning air and remembered what her mother had told her about the geese. The geese were moving early. She found a group of men outside the freight office, drinking coffee and arguing about the price of oats. Teamsters, mostly. Men who worked for wages and owned their own animals and thought they understood winter because they had survived it. Marit approached them. They stopped talking. The cold is coming early this year, she said. If you have wood stacked outside, you need to cover it or move it. When the storms come, the drifts will bury it. Then the thaw will soak it. Then the freeze will lock it solid. You will not be able to use it. One of the men, a young teamster with a red beard, laughed. Who are you? Marit Solheim. Solheim's girl, the one on the claim. He looked at the others. She's giving us winter advice now. I am telling you what will happen. And how do you know what will happen? Because I have calculated it. A man needs to burn. A man, the red-bearded teamster said, cutting her off. What do you know about what a man needs? The others laughed. Marit felt heat rise to her face, but she did not stop. About a household needs between 5 and 8 cords of wood to survive a hard winter, depending on the quality of the wood and the tightness of the dwelling. Most of you have your wood stacked in the open. I have seen it. If the storms come the way I think they will come. You think, another man said. A 16-year-old girl thinks she knows better than men who have been hauling freight since before she was born. I am not saying I know better. I am saying, you are saying we are fools. I am saying the wood is vulnerable. The red-bearded teamster stepped closer. My woodpile has survived 3 winters. It will survive a 4th. Go back to your rotting cabin and your dead father's debt, and let the men who know this country handle the men's work. Marit looked at each of them. None of them would meet her eyes. She turned and walked back toward the claim. Behind her, she heard one of them say, Petter's girl thinks she can see the future. Maybe she should sell fortunes instead of firewood. They laughed again. The sound followed her all the way out of town. She had not always been alone in knowing things. Her mother, Ragna, had taught her before the coughing sickness took her in 79. Marit had been 9 years old, and her mother had spent the last winter of her life teaching her daughter everything she could pass on before the end. How to read the sky for storms, how to count the days between the first frost and the hard freeze, how to look at a root cellar and know whether it was dug right. The root cellar was the thing Marit remembered most. They had lived in Wisconsin then, on a farm with a small cellar her grandfather had dug into a hillside. The cellar stayed cool in summer and merely cold in winter, never freezing, because the earth itself held steady. Her mother had taken her inside on an autumn afternoon and explained why. The ground does not feel the sky, her mother had said. 3 feet down, 4 feet down, the ground remembers summer long after the air forgets it. That is why we bury things to keep them. The earth is a blanket. But it is cold down here. Cold, yes, but not killing cold, not knife cold. The cellar stays the same while the world above changes. Her mother had picked up a carrot from the bin and shown her how firm it was, how the skin had not shriveled. We put things underground to protect them from the extremes, from the heat that rots and the freeze that cracks. Marit remembered the smell of that cellar, damp earth and root vegetables and the faint sweetness of stored apples. She remembered the way the air felt different, heavier somehow, and more still. She remembered her mother saying one more thing before they climbed back out into the sunlight. The worst enemy of stored things is not cold alone. It is wet followed by freeze. If you can keep something dry and sheltered from the worst of the cold, you can keep it usable long after exposed things have been ruined. Marit had not thought about those words in years. She thought about them now. She thought about them while she stared at her rotting woodpile and calculated how many cords she would need and how many she could possibly cut and haul and stack before the snow came. She thought about them while she lay awake at night, listening to the wind test the gaps in her walls. She thought about them until the idea arrived. The idea arrived 3 weeks after her father's burial, on an August night when the first true chill crept across the claim. Marit had spent the day cutting cottonwood from the river bottom. She had dragged 2 pieces back to the cabin, each one taking more than an hour because she had no sled and no horse, and had to roll the logs over uneven ground. By the time she stopped, her hands were raw, and her shoulders ached, and she had added perhaps 1/8 of a cord to her pile. At that rate, she would die before she finished. She sat on the ground beside her cabin and looked at the exposed woodpile. The sun was going down and the temperature was dropping, and she could feel the first edge of what was coming. Not winter yet, but the warning of winter. The scout before the army. And she thought, what if I buried it? Not like a grave, like a cellar. What if she dug a chamber underground, lined it to keep the water out, covered it to keep the snow off, and stored her wood inside? What if she could reach her fuel from within the cabin, through a hatch in the floor, without ever opening the door to the storm? The idea was absurd. She knew it was absurd. Wood needed air to season. Wood stored in damp conditions rotted. Everyone knew that, but her mother's voice came back to her. The worst enemy is wet followed by freeze. Her woodpile was already wet. It had been rained on all summer. When the snow came, it would be buried. When the thaw came, it would be soaked. When the freeze came after the thaw, it would be locked in ice. The wood was going to be ruined either way. But what if she could protect it? What if she built a chamber that stayed dry, lined with stone to stop the seep, drained with gravel to carry water away, capped with sod and planks to shed the snow? The wood would not be exposed to the storm. It would not be buried in drift. It would not thaw and freeze and thaw again until it was useless. It would be underground, yes, but it would be a dry underground, and she could reach it from inside through a short passage and a hatch without losing the heat from her cabin every time she needed fuel. The more she thought about it, the more it seemed possible. Not probable, but possible. The next day she walked to the neighboring claim to ask a question. Ada Keene lived half a mile east, on land her husband had claimed before a fever took him 2 winters past. She was 34, lean and weathered, with 2 children and a cow, and more practical knowledge about Dakota survival than any man in town would admit. She had not spoken to Marit since the burial, but she had sent a loaf of bread. Marit found her mending a fence where her cow had pushed through. "I have a question," Marit said. Ada did not look up from her work. "Go ahead." "When you store vegetables for winter, what matters most?" Ada stopped. She looked at Marit as if trying to determine whether this was a genuine question or a test. "Why?" "I'm thinking about storage, about what keeps things usable and what does not." Ada straightened and pushed her hair back from her face. "Dry," she said. "Dry matters more than cold. A cellar that floods will ruin everything in it. A cellar that stays dry will keep root vegetables through to spring." "What about ventilation?" "You need some airflow, or the damp builds up and mold takes over. But not too much, or you lose the temperature stability." "And the earth itself? Does it protect against the cold?" "Yes. Below the frost line, the ground stays warmer than the air. Not warm, but warmer. It keeps things from freezing solid." Marit nodded. "What if someone wanted to store something other than vegetables? Something larger?" Ada frowned. "Like what?" "Wood." The silence stretched. Ada looked at Marit the way Jonas Hegland had looked at her, like she was examining something that might be dangerous. "Wood belongs stacked where the air can take it," Ada said finally, "not buried where the earth sweats. Wood that is already cut and partly dried, not green wood. Dry wood that needs to be protected from storm and drift." "That is not how it is done." "I know, but the question is whether it could be done." Ada set down her fencing tools and crossed her arms. "If you built a chamber that stayed dry, truly dry, with drainage and a hard floor and ventilation, then the wood would not rot, in theory. But keeping water out of a hole in Dakota ground is harder than you think. The spring thaw will find every crack. The seep will come up from below if you are not above it." "And if you built on a rise, above the water table, with a gravel bed to carry drainage away?" Ada did not answer immediately. She looked at Marit for a long time. "You're not asking idle questions," Ada said. "No. You are thinking of doing this." "Yes." Ada shook her head. "You have no help, no horse, no tools worth speaking of. You cannot cut enough wood to fill a cellar, and you certainly cannot build a cellar fit to keep it dry. And even if you could, you would be gambling your life on something that no one has ever tried. The alternative is certain death. The alternative is leaving. I cannot leave." "Cannot or will not?" "Both." Ada picked up her tools again. "Then I cannot help you. I think you are wrong. I think you will bury good wood like a fool and die surrounded by rot. But I suppose you will do it whether I approve or not." "I suppose I will." Marit walked back to her claim. She had her answer. Not an endorsement, but a confirmation that the physics were possible. If she could keep the chamber dry, she could keep the chamber dry. She had to. The news of what she was planning reached Elias Rook by the second week of August. Rook owned the general store in Medora. He was 46, thick through the shoulders, with small eyes that made him look like he was always calculating odds. He had come west to profit, not to settle, and he had found a way to profit that required no cattle and no farming, only the desperation of others. He extended credit. He held notes. He waited. Every winter, families ran low on fuel. Every winter, they came to Rook with hats in hand, asking for coal scraps or cut wood or anything that would keep them alive until spring. Rook sold it to them at twice what it would cost in summer. He wrote the debts into new notes, and in spring, when they could not pay, he took what they had. He had acquired 3 claims this way. He expected to acquire a 4th when Marit Solheim failed, except now she was talking about burying her fuel underground. He first heard it from the red-bearded teamster, who mentioned it as a joke. The Solheim girl thought she could outsmart Winter by digging a hole. The teamster laughed. Rook did not. He thought about it all week. Then he walked out to the Solheim claim. He found her digging. She had marked a rectangle on the ground behind her cabin, about 3 feet wide and perhaps 12 feet long, stretching from a spot beneath her floor to a point past the cabin's drip line. She was knee-deep in earth, throwing spadefuls over her shoulder with a rhythm that suggested she had been at it for hours. Rook watched her for a while before announcing himself. "That is ambitious," he said. Marit stopped digging but did not climb out of the trench. "Mr. Rook, I heard you were building something unusual. I came to see for myself." He walked closer and looked at the dimensions she had marked. "A root cellar?" "Something like it. For fuel, they tell me." "Yes." Rook smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just confirmed good news. "You plan to bury your firewood in a hole." "I plan to build a dry chamber with drainage and ventilation and access from inside my cabin." That is a fancy way of describing a grave for wood. "You may think what you like." "I think," Rook said, "that you are a desperate girl who is grasping at a fantasy rather than accepting the truth. The truth is that you cannot survive here. You do not have the money, the labor, or the knowledge. You will fail, and when you fail, I will take this property as payment for your father's debt." Marit climbed out of the trench. She was covered in dirt and sweat, and her hands were bleeding at the calluses. She stood before Rook and did not look away. "I have until first frost to pay the note." "You do, and you will not pay it." "Then I have until first frost to prove you wrong." "Prove me wrong how? By digging a grave for your fuel? By telling teamsters they do not understand winter? By playing at survival while the cold comes closer every day?" "By surviving?" Rook laughed. It was a worse laugh than Heglin's, thinner, with more contempt. "Survival is not a matter of cleverness, girl. It is a matter of resources. You have none. Your father had none. He came here with dreams and died with debts, and you will follow him into the same cold ground." "Perhaps." "Not perhaps. Certainly." "Then you have nothing to worry about. You will get your property and I will be gone and the matter will be settled." "I have nothing to worry about," Rook agreed. "But I came to offer you an alternative. Leave now. Walk away before winter. I will forgive the debt in exchange for immediate possession of the claim. You will have nothing, but you will be alive. Stay, and you will have nothing and also be dead." Marit looked at the trench she had dug. Half a day's work, 12 feet to go before she even reached the chamber dimensions. Walls to line after that, a cap to build, a hatch to frame. Weeks of labor, alone, with no guarantee of success. She looked back at Rook. "No. No. I will not leave. This is my father's land. This is my mother's teaching. This is everything they left me, and I will not give it to a man who profits from desperation." Rook's smile faded. His eyes went hard. "Then die," he said. "Die in your hole like the fool you are, and when the snow melts in spring, I will take what remains and sell it to someone with sense." He turned and walked back toward town. Marit watched him go. Then she climbed back into the trench and kept digging. The work went slowly. By the end of August, she had dug the trench to chest depth. By the first week of September, she had reached the location of the vault chamber and begun widening the pit. By mid-September, she had moved enough earth to begin thinking about walls. But thinking about walls meant thinking about stone, and stone meant labor she did not have. The river bottom held fieldstone, rounded pieces tumbled down from the broken country above. She could collect them, load them into a makeshift sled she had built from salvaged planks, and drag them back to the claim one load at a time. Each round trip took 3 hours. Each load provided enough stone to line perhaps 2 feet of wall. She needed 30 feet of wall for the chamber alone. She needed 45 more loads of stone. She had perhaps 6 weeks before the ground froze too hard to work. The arithmetic was brutal. 3 hours per load, 45 loads, 135 hours of hauling, and that was before she lifted each stone and set it in place, fitted them together, chinked the gaps with clay, and built the cap structure above. She was going to fail. She knew it, and she kept working anyway because the alternative was to stop. The man who saved her appeared on a cold morning in late September. Marit was dragging her sled up from the river when she saw him standing at the edge of her claim, watching. He was old, 60 at least, maybe more, with a face like weathered oak and hands that looked too large for his thin frame. He leaned on a stick and did not move as she approached. "You are the girl building the buried wood room," he said. Marit stopped. "Yes. I am Toliff Vangen." She knew the name. The others in town mentioned him sometimes, the old Norwegian who lived in a shack near the river breaks. A quarryman, they said, who had come west after a blasting injury left him lame. He kept to himself. He bought little. He sold nothing. "May I see it?" he asked. Marit hesitated. Then she led him to the trench. Toliff lowered himself carefully to the edge and looked down. He studied the dimensions, the angle of the walls, the depth of the cut. He was silent for a long time. "You marked your trench uphill from the seep lines," he said finally. "Yes." "And you dug it to pitch away from the cabin." "Yes." "Why?" "So the water drains out instead of in." Toliff looked at her. His eyes were pale blue, and they held something she had not seen from anyone else on this frontier. Not pity, not contempt, but recognition. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother taught me about root cellars when I was a girl. The rest I reasoned out." "Your reasoning is correct." He pushed himself back to his feet. "Your execution will kill you anyway." "Why?" "Because you are laying the stone wrong. You are stacking it like a wall above ground, straight up, pressure outward. Underground. The earth pushes back. Your walls will bow and collapse before spring." Marit felt something sink in her chest. "Then what do I do?" "You batter them. Angle them inward as they rise. Let the earth's pressure push the stones tighter together instead of apart." He pointed at the trench with his stick. "A quarryman learns this before he learns his name. Your mother taught you water. I can teach you stone." "Why would you help me?" Toliff shrugged. "I heard you arguing drainage at the store last week. Most people argue louder when they know less. You argued quieter when you knew more. That is rare. What do you want in return?" "Conversation, labor. Someone who will listen when I explain why their first wall course is wrong." He looked toward the river. "I am old, and I am lame, and I am bored. You are young, and you are ignorant, and you are going to die unless someone teaches you properly. I think we can help each other." Marit looked at the trench. She looked at the pile of stone she had dragged up from the river. She looked at the sky, where the geese were still moving south in long, dark lines. "When do we start?" she asked. "Now," Toliff said. "Take out every stone you have already placed. We are going to lay them again correctly." They worked. Toliff could not lift the heavy stones. His back would not allow it, but he could direct, instruct, and correct. He sat at the edge of the pit with his stick and watched Marit place each piece, telling her when the angle was wrong, when the fit was poor, when she needed to try a different stone. "Drainage before walls," he said on the first day. "A gravel bed at the bottom, 8 inches deep, covered with ash and then packed clay. The water finds the gravel and runs downhill. If you skip this step, everything above it fails." She collected gravel from the riverbank. She collected ash from the burn pits behind town, where people cleared brush and refuse. She layered them according to Toliff's instruction and packed the clay above until the floor of her chamber was hard and smooth. "Now the walls," he said. But understand this. You are not building a wall. You are building a vessel that holds air while the earth tries to crush it. The earth will push. The stones must push back. If you lay them vertical, the push comes at the joints and tears them apart. If you batter them 10 degrees, 15 degrees, the push drives them together. The more the earth squeezes, the tighter they hold. He made her practice on a single course until she could feel the difference between a stone set right and a stone set wrong. A wall stands because the weight knows where to go, he told her. Every stone carries the weight to the stone below it. The bottom stones carry everything. If the bottom is wrong, the top cannot be right. Marit listened. She watched. She worked. By the first week of October, the walls of the chamber were shoulder high. By the second week, they were ready for the cap timbers. By the third week, the cottonwood planks lay across the top, overlapping like scales, ready to receive the sod and clay that would seal the chamber from the weather above. Each day, the air grew colder. Each day, the geese flew farther south. Each day, the sky pressed lower against the hills, and Marit could feel the clock running out. "Will it work?" she asked Toliff one evening as they sat beside the nearly completed vault. He did not answer for a long time. He looked at the chamber, at the hatch frame she had framed into her cabin floor, at the sky where the last light was fading. "The stone is good," he said finally. "The drainage is good. The cap will shed water if you pack the clay thick enough. The question is whether you can fill it in time. I have 8 days before the first hard freeze. Then you have 8 days to move enough wood to survive until spring." Marit looked at her pile, the wood she had dragged and cut and sorted over the past 3 months. It was larger now, perhaps 2 cords, maybe a little more. Still not enough for a hard winter, but enough to begin. "I will move what I can," she said. "Then we should start tomorrow," Toliff said. "The light is going, and so am I." He rose, took his stick, and walked back toward his shack by the river breaks. Marit sat alone beside the chamber. The stars came out, one by one. The cold settled over the claim like a weight. She had built something. She did not know if it would save her, but she had built it. The first snow came on October 29th. Marit watched it fall from her cabin window, light flakes drifting down through gray air, melting as they touched the ground. It was not the storm, not yet. This was the scout, the advance warning, the last message before the army arrived. She had moved 3/4 of a cord into the vault. Cross-stacked for air circulation, barkside positioned the way Toliff had shown her, kindling tied in bundles and hung from pegs along the wall. The chamber smelled of dry wood and earth and the faint mineral scent of stone. The hatch lay flush with her floor, beneath the space where her bed frame would go. She had tested it 6 times, lifting it, descending the short passage, retrieving an armload, climbing back up, closing the hatch against the cold. Each cycle took less than a minute. Outside, her remaining woodpile sat under the crude cover she had built from salvaged planks and canvas scraps. It was not perfect. It would not stop the drifts completely, but it was better than leaving the pile exposed. She had done what she could. There was no more time. Toliff had not come for 3 days. His cough had worsened, and she had told him to rest. But the morning before the snow, he had sent a boy from town with a message scratched on a piece of brown paper. "Vent rod clear, hatch tight. Count your wood. Trust the stone." She had counted. 78 pieces in the chamber plus bundles of kindling. Enough for perhaps 40 days of careful burning if she rationed well and the chamber kept its promise. Outside, she had maybe another cord and a half if the snow did not bury it too deep and the thaw did not ruin it. It was not enough for a full winter, but it might be enough to reach spring. The snow fell. The temperature dropped. The sky pressed lower against the broken hills, and Marit Solheim waited for the storm that would prove her right or kill her. The first week of November brought a calm that felt like a lie. The snow from October had melted. The temperature hovered above freezing during the day and dropped to merely cold at night. The sky stayed gray, but the storms held off, and men in town began talking about a mild winter. Marit did not believe them. She spent every hour of daylight working. She hauled another quarter cord from the river bottom, deadfall cottonwood that she dragged piece by piece across ground that was beginning to harden. Each load took longer than the one before because her body was failing. Her shoulders burned. Her grip had weakened. The calluses on her palms had cracked open and bled, and she wrapped them in rags that turned brown with dried blood by midday. She split what she could with the cracked handle maul, resting between swings to keep from vomiting. She stacked the split pieces in the vault, building the rows higher according to Toliff's pattern, cross-stacked with gaps for airflow, the largest pieces at the bottom where the temperature stayed steadiest. She ate once a day, sometimes twice if her stomach would hold it. Her dress hung looser on her frame, and when she caught her reflection in the cabin's single piece of mirror glass, she saw a face she did not recognize, sharper, older, with shadows under the eyes that had not been there in summer. On November 5th, Toliff came to see the finished chamber. He had been too sick to walk since the snow. The cough had settled deep in his chest, and his breathing rattled when he moved. But he came anyway, leaning heavy on his stick, pausing every few steps to rest. Marit helped him down the short passage to the vault. He stood in the center of the chamber, his head nearly touching the cap timbers, and looked at what they had built together. The walls rose 6 feet at the center, curving inward as they climbed, each stone fitted to its neighbor, with clay packed tight in every gap. The floor was hard-packed and dry, the drainage bed invisible beneath it but working. She had tested it twice by pouring water in the corners and watching it vanish into the gravel below. The vent pipe rose through the cap, a salvaged length of stovepipe that Toliff had shown her how to angle so rain and snow could not enter, but air could still escape. The wood filled half the chamber, 78 pieces now, plus the kindling bundles, plus a dozen splits she had added in the last 3 days. Toliff said nothing for a long time. He ran his hand along one wall, feeling the batter of the stones, testing the joints with his fingertips. "The clay is holding," he said finally. "Yes. The vent is drawing. I can feel the air moving. I tested it with candle smoke yesterday. The flame bent toward the pipe." He nodded slowly. Then he looked at her. "You will live through this winter," he said, "if you ration correctly, if the cap holds, if the storms do not collapse your outer pile before you can reach it. That is many conditions. Every survival has many conditions. You have met more of them than most." He paused, and the cough took him, a deep, rattling spasm that bent him over and left him gasping. When he straightened, there was blood on his lips. Marit reached for him. He waved her away. "I am dying," he said. "Not today, not next week, but soon. My lungs are full of the stone dust I breathed for 30 years in the quarries. There is no cure. Toliff, listen to me." His voice was steady despite the rasp. "You have built something that works. You have understood the principle, not just the procedure. When I am gone, you will know why the walls batter, and why the drainage runs downhill, and why the vent draws air through the chamber. You will be able to teach others. I do not want to teach others. I want you to stay alive. What you want does not change what is coming." He looked around the chamber one more time. "A wall stands because the weight knows where to go. Remember that. Not just for stone, for everything." He climbed back up the passage, moving slowly, pausing twice to catch his breath. At the top, he turned back to look at her. "The storms are coming," he said. "I can feel them in my bones. Within the week. Maybe sooner. You need to move everything you can into this chamber before they arrive. After the first drift, you will not be able to reach your outside pile for days, maybe weeks. How much time do I have?" 3 days, perhaps 4. He walked away across the hardening ground, his stick tapping with each step. Marit watched him until he disappeared into the gray distance. Then she went back to work. The next 3 days were the hardest of her life. She woke before dawn and worked until she could no longer see. She dragged wood from the outside pile, split what needed splitting, and carried it piece by piece down into the vault. Her back seized on the second day, and she kept going. Her vision blurred on the third day, and she kept going. She stopped eating because there was no time, and because her stomach would not hold food anyway. By the evening of November 8th, she had added another quarter cord to the chamber. The vault was 3/4 full now, not enough for a full winter, but enough to keep her alive for weeks if she rationed carefully. Outside, her pile had dwindled to perhaps half a cord, covered by the crude shelter she had built. It would not survive a major storm intact. But if the vault held, if the wood stayed dry, if she burned slowly, if... She ate a small meal that night, hard bread and dried meat and water from the bucket she kept by the stove. Then she banked her fire and lay down on the rope bed and slept. She did not dream. She was too exhausted to dream. She woke to a sound she had never heard before. It was not wind. It was not quite a roar. It was something between the two, a deep, sustained pressure against the walls of her cabin, like the world itself was leaning against her door. The light through the window was gray-white. The oiled paper bulged inward with each gust. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped 10 degrees while she slept. Marit threw off her blanket and crossed to the door. She had to push with her shoulder to open it against the wind. When she did, the cold hit her like a physical blow. November 9th, 1886. The sky had vanished. Everything was gray, gray above, gray around, gray below, where the snow was already drifting against the sod banking. The wind came from the northwest in a sustained shriek that made her eyes water and her exposed skin burn. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. She had heard Jonas Hägglund talk about cold like this. She had heard the men at the freight yard describe storms that came down from Canada, like armies, burying everything in their path. She had thought she understood. She had not understood. The cold was not a sensation. It was a presence, something that invaded her lungs with every breath, that turned the moisture in her nose to ice, that found every gap in her clothing and pressed through to the skin beneath. She stood in the doorway for perhaps 10 seconds, and her fingers began to lose feeling. She forced the door shut and leaned against it. Through the walls, she could hear the wind rising. The cabin groaned. Something struck the roof, a branch, perhaps, or a piece of debris, and the whole structure shuddered. Marit looked at her stove. The fire had burned down to embers. She needed wood. She walked to the hatch beneath her bed frame and pulled it open. The air that rose from the vault was cold, but not killing cold, not the knife-edge cold of the wind outside. It was cellar cold, earth cold, the temperature of ground that had not yet felt the full weight of winter. She descended the passage and stood in her chamber. The wood was there. The wood was dry. The wood was waiting. She selected 3 pieces, medium splits, good for a steady burn, and carried them back up. She closed the hatch behind her, rebuilt the fire, and sat before the stove while the warmth returned to her fingers. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, the fire burned. The first day of the storm, she stayed in the cabin and let the fire do its work. She ate sparingly. She checked the chamber twice, counting pieces, calculating how long her supply would last at different burn rates. Slow fire, 1 piece every 3 hours. She could stretch the vault supply for 60 days or more. Fast fire, 2 pieces every 2 hours. She would run out in a month. She chose slow fire. The cabin was cold but bearable. Her breath misted in the air, but her fingers worked and her mind stayed clear. Through the window, she watched the drift build against the north wall. By noon, it had reached the bottom of the glass. By evening, it had covered half. By the next morning, the window was a white rectangle, and the only light came from the cracks around the door. The second day, she tried to check her outside pile. She forced the door open against the drift, a wall of compacted snow that had built up to waist height during the night. The wind hit her immediately, driving ice crystals into her face like needles. She could see perhaps 10 feet in any direction. Everything beyond that was white blur. She found her pile by memory, by counting steps from the cabin corner. The shelter she had built was gone. The canvas had torn away. The planks had scattered. The wood was buried under 3 feet of drift, and when she dug down to reach it, she found what she had feared. The outer pieces were crusted with ice, fused to the snow around them, frozen into a solid mass. She managed to free 2 pieces. They were cold and wet and heavy with absorbed moisture. She carried them back to the cabin and set them by the stove to dry. It would take hours before she could burn them, if she could burn them at all. The vault wood was still dry. The vault wood was still accessible. The vault wood was the only thing keeping her alive. She closed the door, barred it against the wind, and descended into the chamber to retrieve another armload. On the 4th day of the storm, someone came to her door. Marit heard the pounding through the wind, a desperate, rhythmic hammering that sounded like someone using both fists. She pushed the door open and found Ada Keen collapsed against the drift, her face white with cold, her lips blue, her eyes wild with fear. "My son," Ada said. "Henrik, he is sick. His chest. He cannot breathe properly, and the fever is rising, and my fire." She stopped. Her voice cracked. "I ran out 3 days ago. I've been burning furniture. I'm out of furniture." Marit pulled her inside and closed the door. Ada stood in the center of the cabin, shaking violently, ice crystals melting from her eyebrows and the collar of her coat. She looked at the stove, where a steady fire burned. She looked at Marit's dry floor, her banked coals, her relative warmth. "How?" Ada asked. Marit did not answer with words. She walked to the hatch, lifted it, and descended. A moment later, she climbed back up with an armload of dry, split cottonwood. Ada stared at the wood, then at the hatch, then at Marit. "The buried room," she said. "It worked." "Yes. How much do you have?" "Enough. Enough for you." "What about—" Ada stopped. The question died in her throat. She would not ask for charity. She could not afford to owe more than she could repay. Marit set the wood on the floor between them. "Take this to your son," she said. "Bring your fire back. I will bring more tomorrow if the wind allows." "I cannot." "Take it." Ada looked at the wood. She looked at Marit. And then she did something Marit had not expected. She began to cry. "I told you it would fail," Ada said through her tears. "I told you wood belonged stacked in the air, not buried in the ground. I told you. You told me what you believed. You were not cruel. You did not mock me. But I was wrong. Then learn from it. Take the wood. Save your son." Ada gathered the pieces in her arms. They were heavy and awkward, but she held them like they were made of gold. At the door, she turned back. "I will repay this." "I know." Ada pushed out into the storm and vanished into the white. Marit closed the door, descended into the vault, and began counting what remained. On the 6th day, Jonas Hägglund came. He did not knock. He pushed the door open without warning, covered in snow, his face red with windburn and effort. He had been digging. Marit could see the marks on his gloves, the exhaustion in his frame. "My pile is buried," he said. 4 feet of drift on top of ice crust, on top of frozen logs. I have been chopping for 2 days, and I cannot free enough to keep my cabin warm." Marit looked at him. "You told me I would freeze first and lie second," she said. Hägglund's jaw tightened. "I remember what I said." "Do you remember what I said?" "You said you would find a way." Marit walked to the hatch and lifted it. The cold, dry air of the chamber rose to meet them. "I found it," she said. Hägglund descended the passage without being invited. She heard his footsteps stop, heard the long silence as he looked at the walls, the drainage, the carefully stacked wood that had survived a week of the worst cold Dakota had delivered in years. When he climbed back up, his face was different. The contempt was gone. Something like shame had taken its place. "I was wrong," he said. "You understood something I did not." "I understood what my mother taught me. The earth remembers summer longer than the air." "A root cellar for fuel." "A buried chamber, stone-lined, drained, dry." Hägglund removed his hat. He held it in both hands like a supplicant. "I have not come to mock you," he said. "I have come to ask for help." "Then ask." "I need wood, enough to keep my fire alive until I can dig out my pile. 3 pieces, maybe 4. I will repay it with labor in spring." Marit descended into the vault and retrieved 4 medium splits. She handed them to Hegland, and he took them with hands that trembled, not from cold, but from something else. "I told the men at the freight yard you were a fool," he said. "I told them your father's girl would die in her father's cabin, trying to outthink the weather. I know. I was wrong about that too. Yes, you were." He tucked the wood under his arm and moved toward the door. Before he left, he turned back. "The Hoffman family, 3 claims east," he said. "They are running low. The widow Rasmussen is out entirely. Elias Rook's own supply is buried so deep he has been buying scraps at triple price from anyone who has them. I cannot supply the whole settlement. No, but you can keep people alive until they can dig out. You can give them time." He put his hat back on. "That is more than any of us did for you." He pushed out into the storm. Marit stood in her cabin, the fire burning steady, the hatch at her feet, and thought about what Hegland had said. She could not save everyone. She did not have enough wood, but she could give them time. Over the next week, she became the center of something she had not expected. Word spread. The girl on the Solheim claim had fuel. The girl had built a buried chamber that stayed dry while outside piles froze solid. The girl who had been mocked at the freight yard, who had been dismissed by teamsters, who had been told she would die like a fool, that girl had wood when no one else did. They came one at a time, fighting through the drifts, their faces marked by cold and desperation. Ada came twice more for Henrik, who was recovering slowly. Hegland came once to repay his debt with news. The temperature had dropped again, to 32 degrees below zero, and the road to Medora was buried under drifts that reached the eaves of buildings. The Hoffman family sent their eldest son, a boy of 14, who had walked 2 miles through waist-deep snow. Marit gave him 5 pieces and made him promise to ration them. The widow Rasmussen came herself, a woman of 60 who had lost her husband to a blizzard 3 winters past. She did not ask for help. She stood in the doorway and looked at Marit's fire and began to turn away, pride stronger than survival. Marit caught her arm. "Wait." She descended into the vault and emerged with an armload. The widow wept. By the 12th day of the storm, Marit had distributed half her reserve. She sat in her cabin that night, counting what remained. 39 pieces in the vault. Perhaps 15 days of careful burning. The storm showed no signs of breaking. The cold had not lifted, and people were still coming. She could stop giving. She could save herself and let the others find their own way. That was the rational choice. That was the choice Elias Rook would make, but she was not Elias Rook. She descended into the vault, selected 2 pieces, and climbed back up to feed her fire. Tomorrow, someone else would come. Tomorrow, she would give them what she could. And if she ran out before spring, then at least she would die having done something that mattered. On November 22nd, Henrik Keene nearly stopped breathing. Marit heard about it from Ada, who appeared at her door before dawn with a face that said everything words could not say. The boy's fever had spiked in the night. His breath came in shallow gasps. The rattle in his chest had deepened to something that sounded like drowning. "The cold got into him," Ada said. "The cabin. There were gaps I did not know about. The wind came through while he slept." "How is your fire?" "Burning, but low. I have been stretching what you gave me." Marit grabbed her coat and her mittens. She loaded as much wood as she could carry, 7 pieces, her arms shaking under the weight, and followed Ada out into the gray morning. The storm had paused. The wind had dropped to a whisper. The sky hung low and flat, promising more to come, but for now there was stillness. The drifts had sculpted the landscape into something alien, smooth white curves broken by the dark lines of fence posts and the humped shapes of buried buildings. They reached Ada's cabin in 20 minutes. Inside, Henrik lay on a pallet near the stove, wrapped in every blanket Ada owned. His face was pale except for 2 spots of red on his cheeks. His eyes were closed, and his breath came in quick, shallow pulls that sounded like something tearing. Marit fed the fire. She built it higher than Ada had dared to build it, pushing more heat into the small cabin, driving back the cold that had crept into the boy's lungs. "Open his shirt," she said. Ada loosened the cloth. Marit took a kettle of water from the stove, warm but not boiling, and soaked a rag in it. She laid the rag across Henrik's chest. The boy flinched but did not wake. "Steam," Marit said. "My mother used steam when I was sick as a child. The warm air loosens what is tight in the lungs. Will it work? I do not know." They worked through the morning, replacing the rags as they cooled, feeding the fire, keeping the air as warm and moist as they could make it. Outside, the sky darkened again. The wind began to rise. Around noon, Henrik coughed. It was a wet, terrible sound, the sound of something breaking loose. But it was followed by breath, a deeper breath, a breath that did not rattle. He coughed again and again, each time expelling more of whatever had been drowning him. His color began to change. The red spots faded. The pallor retreated. By evening, his fever had broken. He was sleeping normally, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm that sounded nothing like dying. Ada sat beside her son, holding his hand, her face streaked with tears she did not try to hide. "You saved him," she said. "The heat saved him. The wood saved him." "You brought the wood." "I brought what I could." Ada looked at Marit. There was something in her eyes that had not been there before. Not gratitude, exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one survivor looking at another. "When this is over," Ada said, "teach me to build one, a chamber like yours, so this never happens again." Marit nodded. "I will." She stayed until nightfall, until she was certain Henrik was stable. Then she pulled on her coat and stepped out into the rising wind. The walk back to her claim took an hour through fresh drift. By the time she reached her cabin, her legs were numb and her face was burned by cold. She stumbled through the door, fed her fire, and collapsed onto her bed without undressing. She had given away most of what she had. She had perhaps 3 weeks of fuel left. The storm was not over, but Henrik Keene was alive. She closed her eyes and slept. The storm broke on November 28th. Marit woke to silence, not the muffled silence of falling snow, but true silence, the absence of wind, the absence of the constant pressure that had defined her world for 3 weeks. She pushed open her door and stepped outside. The sky was blue. The sun hung low in the south, casting long shadows across a landscape transformed. The drifts had reshaped everything. Cabins had become white mounds. Fence posts had vanished. The horizon had flattened into a single unbroken curve of white. But the air was still. She could see for the first time since November 9th, farther than 10 feet. She could see the river bottom, a dark line of trees against the snow. She could see the smoke rising from Ada's cabin to the east. She could see in the distance figures moving, people emerging from their shelters, beginning the long work of digging out. Marit stood in the cold sunshine and breathed. 20 days. 20 days of storm, of drift, of temperature that had dropped to 41 degrees below zero and stayed there for a week. 20 days of survival when every teamster in Medora had said she would be dead by the second frost. She was not dead. She was alive, and her chamber had held, and people had survived because of what she had built. She walked to the spot where her outside pile had been and began to dig. The snow was packed hard, compressed by the wind into something that felt more like stone than powder. But she dug anyway, clearing a path, reaching down toward the wood that had been buried beneath. She found ice. She found the fused mass that had once been her secondary supply, logs frozen together, sheathed in a crust of compacted snow that would take days to break apart. It did not matter. The vault had held. The vault had enough. She had survived. The aftermath brought visitors. They came over the following days once the roads were passable enough for walking, once people had dug out their own doors and begun to take stock of what remained. They came not to ask for wood. The immediate crisis had passed, and those who had enough to survive the storm had enough to reach spring, but to see. They wanted to see the buried chamber. They wanted to understand how a 16-year-old girl had done what experienced men could not. Jonas Hägglund came with 2 other freighters. They descended into the vault and studied the walls, the drainage, the cap structure. They asked questions: how deep, what angle, what stone, what clay. Marit answered them all. "This is not magic," she said. "This is physics. The earth moderates temperature. The stone keeps water out. The drainage carries seep away. The vent allows air to move. Any of you could build one." "But none of us did," Hegland said. "No, none of you listened when I tried to tell you." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Good. Marit did not try to fill it. Ada came with a measuring string and a piece of charcoal, sketching the dimensions onto a scrap of canvas. She asked about the drainage bed, about the gravel depth, about where Marit had found the stone. She was already planning her own build for next autumn. Even the widow Rasmussen came, walking the half-mile from her claim with the careful steps of someone who had learned not to trust the cold. She did not stay long. She looked at the chamber, nodded once, and pressed something into Marit's hand, a small silver coin, worn smooth with age. "It is not payment," the widow said. "It is acknowledgement." She left before Marit could respond. The one person who did not come was Elias Rook. Marit knew he had survived. Word traveled fast in country this empty, and Rook's survival was remarked upon with something between relief and disappointment. He had burned through most of his own supply, had bought scraps at premium prices, had spent the storm locked in his store while his carefully hoarded inventory kept him alive. But he had not lost. His buildings still stood, his credit notes were still valid, and he still held the paper on Peter Solheim's debt. The note came due in December. Marit had $17 now, her original $13 plus what she had earned selling wood during the storm to those who could pay. The debt was $41.70. She was still going to lose the claim, unless something changed. The debt came due on December 1st. Marit walked into Medora with $17 in her pocket and no expectation of mercy. The road had been cleared enough for foot traffic, though drifts still rose shoulder high on either side. The cold had settled into something steady, 20 degrees below zero at night, barely above freezing at midday. Survivable if you had shelter and fuel. She had both. What she did not have was $24.70. Elias Rook was waiting in his store when she arrived. He sat behind his counter with the expression of a man who had already won. The note lay on the wood between them, her father's signature at the bottom, the numbers written in Rook's careful hand. "Miss Solheim," he said, "I expected you yesterday." "I came when I could." "And have you brought the amount owed?" Marit set her coins on the counter. $17. Rook counted them without touching them, his eyes doing the work. "You're short," he said. "I know. By $24.70. "I know." Rook leaned back in his chair. "Then you understand what happens now. The note is in default. The claim reverts to me as creditor. You have 30 days to remove your personal effects before I take possession." Marit had expected this. She had prepared for it during the long walk into town, rehearsing the words she would say, the argument she would make. But before she could speak, the door behind her opened. Jonas Hegland walked in. Behind him came Ada Keen, and behind her came the widow Rasmussen, and behind her came 3 men Marit recognized from the freight yard, the same men who had laughed at her warnings in August. They arranged themselves along the walls of the store. None of them spoke. Rook's expression shifted. "What is this?" "The community has taken an interest in the Solheim debt," Hegland said. "We have pooled our resources." He stepped forward and placed a leather pouch on the counter beside Marit's $17. Rook opened it and counted. His face tightened. $25, Hegland said. "The full amount owed plus 30 cents for your trouble. This is interference. This is commerce. You extended credit. The debt is being repaid. Unless you prefer to refuse payment and explain to a territorial judge why you seized a claim whose note was satisfied in full." Rook looked at Hegland. He looked at Ada. He looked at the widow, at the freighters, at the assembled faces of people who had spent the past month telling each other what the Solheim girl had done when the rest of them were freezing. He took the money. "The note is satisfied," he said, his voice flat. "The claim belongs to Miss Solheim. This matter is concluded." He wrote a receipt, signed it, and pushed it across the counter. Marit took it. Her hands were steady, though her heart was beating hard enough to shake her chest. Outside, in the cold sunlight, she turned to face the people who had saved her father's land. "Why?" she asked. Hegland shrugged. "You gave us fuel when we had none. You kept my fire alive for a week. You saved Ada's boy. The widow ate because of your wood." He paused. "A debt is a debt. We pay what we owe." "I did not ask for repayment." "No. That is why we gave it." They dispersed, walking back to their claims, their errands, their lives. Only Ada remained. "You should know," Ada said quietly, "that Rook is not finished. He lost more than a claim today. He lost face. Men who owed him credit saw what happened. They are talking about paying off their notes early, finding other sources, refusing his terms. What will he do?" "I do not know, but he will do something. He is not a man who accepts defeat." Ada walked away into the cold. Marit stood alone in the street, the receipt in her hand, and felt the weight of what had just happened settle onto her shoulders. She had kept the claim, but she had made an enemy who would not forget. The validation continued through December. People came to the Solheim claim in ones and twos, wrapped against the cold, carrying questions. They wanted to know how deep to dig. They wanted to know what stone to use. They wanted to know whether cottonwood planks would work for the cap or whether they needed something harder. Marit answered them all. She learned to teach the way Toliff had taught her, not by lecturing, but by showing. She took visitors down into the vault and let them feel the walls, the fitted stone, the dry floor. She explained the drainage bed by having them pour water into a corner and watch it vanish. She demonstrated the vent by lighting a candle and holding it near the pipe, showing how the flame bent toward the moving air. "Drainage before walls," she told them. "If the water cannot escape, nothing else matters. The batter of the stone, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. The earth pushes, the walls must push back. Cross-stack for airflow, never pack tight. The wood needs to breathe, or the moisture has nowhere to go." She said the same things over and over, until the words felt worn smooth like river stones. But each time she said them, someone new understood. Each time she explained the principle, someone went home and began planning their own build. By January, 3 families had started digging. By February, 2 chambers were framed and waiting for spring to complete the cap work. By March, when the thaw began and the drifts started their slow collapse into mud, 6 people in the Medora settlement had either built or were building some version of Marit's design. She did not charge for the knowledge. She could have. Rook would have. But she remembered what it felt like to be alone with an impossible problem and no one willing to help. Jonas Hegland was the first to complete a chamber that matched her specifications. He invited her to inspect it on a gray February afternoon, the two of them descending into the cold, dry space while his wife watched from above. "The drainage is good," Marit said, testing the floor with her heel. "The walls are battered correctly. The vent draws." She paused. "You listened." "I have learned to listen when someone knows more than I do." Hegland's voice was gruff, but there was no hostility in it. "It only took me 58 years and one winter that almost killed me. Better late than never." "Is that what your mother taught you?" "No. My mother taught me that the ground remembers summer. Everything else I learned from a man named Toliff Vangen." Hegland nodded slowly. "The old quarry man. I heard he was sick." "He is dying, the stone dust in his lungs." "Will he see spring?" Marit did not answer. She did not know. Toliff did not see spring. He died on the 15th of March, 1887, in the shack by the river breaks where he had lived alone for 6 years. Marit found him when she came to bring him food, a habit she had developed over the winter, walking the mile to his place every few days with bread, dried meat, whatever she could spare. The door was open. The fire was out. He sat in his chair by the cold stove, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed. He looked peaceful, which was more than most people got. She buried him herself. The ground was still frozen, but she found a spot on the south-facing slope above the river where the sun had softened the earth enough to dig. It took her 2 days. Her hands bled, and her back seized, and she kept going anyway because he had taught her what mattered, and this was the last thing she could do for him. She did not mark the grave with a stone. Toliff had spent his life cutting stone and breathing stone dust and dying of stone. She marked it with a piece of cottonwood instead, carved with his name and the words he had taught her. A wall stands because the weight knows where to go. She stood by the grave as the sun set, her shadow stretching long across the snow that still patched the hillside. The river below was beginning to move, the ice cracking and groaning as the current remembered its strength. Toliff was gone. The winter was ending, and she was still here, carrying what he had given her. She walked back to her cabin in the dark, her feet finding the path by memory. When she arrived, she did not light a fire. She sat in the cold and the silence and let herself feel what she had been holding back for months. Then she slept. In the morning, she rose and began preparing for the work that spring would bring. The thaw brought trouble. By early April, the snow had retreated to the shadowed hollows and north-facing slopes. The ground softened. The river rose, and the water that had been locked in ice all winter began to move through the soil, seeking the lowest points, filling every crack and seam it could find. 3 of the chambers that had been built over the winter flooded. 2 of them were minor, water seeping in through gaps in the stone, pooling on floors that had not been graded properly. The owners came to Marit, and she showed them how to dig drainage trenches, how to pack clay into the joints, how to redirect the flow away from their walls. The third was a disaster. It belonged to a family named Hoffman, the same family whose son had walked 2 miles through the storm to ask Marit for fuel. They had built their chamber in the fall, working from descriptions passed third hand through the settlement without ever visiting Marit's vault or asking her guidance directly. The chamber had collapsed. Marit heard about it from Ada, who arrived at her door on a wet April morning with mud on her boots and urgency in her voice. The Hoffman vault caved in during the night. The whole cap structure. It is full of water and broken timber, and everything they stored is ruined. Was anyone hurt? No. But they have lost all their reserve fuel. And the father, Karl Hoffman, he is saying it is your fault. My fault? He says you spread a dangerous idea. He says people built chambers who did not know what they were doing, and now families are suffering because of it. Marit grabbed her coat. Take me there. They walked the 2 miles to the Hoffman claim in silence. When they arrived, Marit saw immediately what had gone wrong. The chamber had been dug in a low spot below the seep line. The walls had been stacked vertical, without batter, and the stones were too small, river pebbles rather than proper field stone. The cap had been built from green timber that had warped over the winter, creating gaps through which water had poured during the thaw. The drainage bed was too shallow, the floor unpacked, the vent missing entirely. Everything Toliff had taught her, they had done the opposite. Karl Hoffman stood beside the ruin, his face dark with anger. He was a large man, thick through the arms, with the look of someone who had worked hard all his life and resented those who had not. You, he said when he saw Marit, you started this. I built a chamber that works. You built one that does not. I built what people described to me. Did you come to see mine? Did you ask me to inspect your site? Did you check the drainage before you started digging? Hoffman's jaw tightened. I should not have to ask a girl for permission to build on my own land. No, but you should have asked for guidance from someone who understood the principles. Pride is not engineering. Pride? Hoffman stepped toward her. He was a foot taller and twice her weight. You want to talk about pride? You spent the whole winter telling people you knew better than men who had survived this territory for years. Now families are flooded, and you call it their fault. It is their fault, and yours. You did not learn the method. You copied the shape without understanding the function. Then explain the function. Explain how any of us were supposed to know what you knew when you kept your knowledge in your own cabin and only helped the people you chose to help. The accusation hit harder than Marit expected. Because it was partly true, she had taught those who came to her, but she had not sought out those who did not come. She had not walked the settlement checking sites, correcting errors, ensuring that the idea she had spread was being implemented correctly. She had assumed that those who wanted to learn would ask, but not everyone asked. Some were too proud. Some were too busy. Some thought they understood when they did not. And now the Hoffmans had lost everything stored in their chamber because Marit had not made sure they knew what she knew. "I will help you rebuild," she said. "I do not want your help. You need it, and I owe it. Not because this collapse was my fault, it was not, but because I should have made certain everyone building these chambers understood how to build them safely." Hoffman stared at her. The anger in his face warred with something else, desperation, perhaps, or exhaustion. "I do not have money to pay you," he said. "I do not want money. I want to make sure this does not happen again." She knelt beside the collapsed chamber and began examining the wreckage, planning how to salvage what could be salvaged, already thinking about where to relocate the new build. Behind her, she heard Hoffman's wife say quietly, "Let her help, Carl. We have nothing left to lose." The Hoffman rebuild took 3 weeks. Marit directed every step, applying Toliff's principles with a precision she had not known she possessed. She found a better site, uphill from the seep lines. She selected proper field stone and taught Carl's sons how to lay it with batter. She supervised the drainage bed, the floor packing, the cap construction. She did not do the labor herself. Her body could not have handled it, but she made sure every piece was placed correctly, every joint chinked properly, every principle followed. When the chamber was finished, she walked the settlement. She visited every family that had built or was building a storage vault. She inspected their sites, their stone, their drainage. She corrected errors before they became failures. She taught the principles again and again until they stuck. Drainage before walls, the batter of the stone. Cross stack for airflow. By the end of April, every chamber in the Medora settlement had been inspected and either approved or corrected. The ones that flooded were repaired. The ones that had never flooded were reinforced. The ones still under construction were guided from the start. Marit did not charge for any of it. She could have. She could have demanded payment, built a business, profited from her knowledge the way Rook profited from others' desperation. But she remembered Toliff sitting at the edge of her trench, teaching her without asking for anything in return except conversation and labor. She remembered what it felt like to have nothing and to find someone who helped anyway. She gave the knowledge away. By summer, the settlement had changed. Not physically, the cabins still stood where they had always stood. The roads still ran where they had always run. But something in the way people talked had shifted. When they spoke of winter, they spoke of preparation. When they spoke of fuel, they spoke of chambers. When they spoke of the girl on the Solheim claim, they spoke with something that sounded like respect. Elias Rook felt the change more than anyone. His winter fuel business had collapsed. Families who had once bought scraps on credit now stored their own reserves in underground vaults. Families who had once begged for extensions now paid their notes early and walked away. The fear that had driven his profits, the terror of running out, of freezing, of dying in the dark, had been replaced by something else. Competence, preparation. The knowledge that survival was possible if you planned correctly. Rook blamed Marit for all of it. He did not say so publicly. He was too shrewd for that, but he found other ways to undermine her. He questioned her methods to anyone who would listen. He suggested that the chambers were temporary solutions, that they would fail in a truly hard winter, that people were risking their lives on the theories of a girl who had never seen a Dakota blizzard before this one. He bought up scrapstone and timber, limiting supply for those who wanted to build. He offered credit to families who promised not to construct underground storage. He spread rumors that the Hoffman collapse had been Marit's design, not their poor execution of it. None of it worked. The chambers kept performing. The fuel stayed dry. The people who had built them came through the following autumn with their reserves intact, while those who had not built them scrambled in the cold. Rook's power came from desperation. Merritt had taught people how to stop being desperate. By the winter of 1887, he had lost more than half his credit business. By the spring of 1888, he was selling his store and preparing to move to Bismarck, where people had not yet learned what the Solheim girl knew. The day he left, Merritt watched his wagon roll east along the road out of town. He did not look back. He did not wave. He simply disappeared into the distance, taking his ledgers and his notes and his resentment with him. Ada stood beside her. "He will tell people you drove him out," Ada said. "He will say you destroyed a legitimate business with dangerous ideas. Let him say what he wants. The chambers work. That is what matters." "And what about you? What happens to the girl who saved the settlement from winter?" Merritt did not answer immediately. She looked at the empty road, the spring sky, the land that was beginning to green with new grass. "I stay," she said. "I build. I teach whoever wants to learn." "That is not much of a plan." "It is enough of one." The blacksmith's assistant arrived in Medora in the summer of 1888. His name was Arne Nesheim, and he came from a Norwegian settlement in Minnesota, where his father had been a smith and his grandfather before that. He was in his late 20s, quiet, with hands that were scarred from forge work and eyes that noticed more than he said. Merritt first met him when she needed a hatch strap repaired. The leather hinge on her vault's interior access had worn through after 2 years of daily use. She brought it to the smithy, where the old smith, a man named Gulbrand, examined it, shook his head, and handed it to his new assistant. "Arne will handle it," Gulbrand said. "He has clever hands." Arne studied the strap in silence. Then he looked at Merritt. "This is from a floor hatch," he said, "for underground access." "Yes." "To a storage chamber." "Yes." "You are the Solheim girl, the one who built the first buried wood vault." "I am Merritt Solheim." "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected. "I have heard about your chambers. In Minnesota, there are men trying to build similar designs. Most of them fail." "Do they follow the principles?" "I do not know the principles. Drainage before walls, battered stone, cross-stacked storage, proper venting." Arne listened. When she finished, he set down the strap and picked up a piece of charcoal. "Show me," he said. She drew the design on a scrap of metal, explaining each element as she sketched it. He asked questions, technical questions, structural questions, questions about load distribution and water pressure and the specific angle of the wall batter. He understood more than she expected. "You have built underground before," she said. "My father's smithy had a cellar for storing coal. I helped dig it when I was 14. It flooded every spring until we rebuilt the drainage." "Then you understand." "I understand some of it, not all." He repaired her hatch strap. The work was quick and clean, the new rivets set perfectly, the leather reinforced where it had worn thin. When she asked what she owed, he shook his head. "No charge. I learned something. That is payment enough." He walked her to the door. At the threshold, he paused. "If you need ironwork for your chambers, vent collars, hatch frames, loading chutes, come to me. I would like to understand the full design." "Why?" "Because good ideas should spread, and I think you have good ideas." He went back to his forge. Merritt walked home with her repaired strap and a feeling she did not quite recognize, the feeling of meeting someone who understood what she was trying to do without being told. Over the following months, Arne became part of the work. He forged vent collars that fit tighter than anything Merritt had salvaged from stovepipe scraps. He designed hatch frames with hinges that did not bind in cold weather. He built loading chutes that could be opened from outside during fair weather and sealed from inside during storms. Each piece was made to her specifications. He did not impose his own ideas. He listened, asked clarifying questions, and built what she described. When he had suggestions, and he often did, he offered them as questions rather than corrections. What if the collar had a baffle here, to prevent snow from drifting into the vent? What if the hatch frame was doubled with an air gap between the layers, to reduce frost buildup on the interior surface? What if we added a removable grate at the loading chute, to keep vermin out while allowing the wood to breathe? Every suggestion was practical. Every suggestion made the design better. Marit found herself visiting the smithy more often than her chamber work required. She told herself it was to discuss improvements. She told herself it was to plan the next batch of fittings. But the truth was simpler. She liked talking to him. She liked the way he listened. She liked the way he worked, carefully, precisely, without wasted motion. She liked that he treated her as a colleague rather than a curiosity. By the autumn of 1888, they were building chambers together, not as employer and worker, but as partners. He handled the ironwork, she handled the stonework. He solved the problems she could not solve, and she solved the problems he could not solve. When the first snow fell, they stood beside a completed vault on the Hoffman claim, Carl's second chamber, built properly this time, ready to face any winter the territory could send. "This is good work," Arna said. "It is. We should do more of it." "We will." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not about chambers or ironwork or survival. "I am not good with words," he said. "But I think you should know." He stopped, started again. "Working with you, it is the best work I have done. The best ironwork. The best anything." He turned and walked toward the road, his breath misting in the cold air. Marit watched him go, feeling the warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She was not ready to name what she felt. Not yet, but she knew it was there, and she knew it was growing. The winter of 1888 was hard, but it was not impossible. The chambers held. The fuel stayed dry. The families who had built them came through with reserves to spare, while those in other settlements, those who had not learned what Marit taught, struggled through the cold the way people had always struggled. Word spread beyond Medora. A freighter from Dickinson asked about the buried vaults. A rancher from 30 miles south rode in to see the Solheim chamber for himself. A letter arrived from a settlement in Montana asking if Marit would send drawings. She sent the drawings. She wrote the principles. She explained everything she knew in letters that went out across the territory, carrying Toliff's teachings to people she would never meet. Drainage before walls, battered stone, cross stack for airflow. A wall stands because the weight knows where to go. By spring, she had received a dozen responses. Some were grateful, some were skeptical. Some asked for more detail, and she provided it. Some asked for nothing, and she heard nothing more. But the idea was spreading. The knowledge was moving. What had begun as one girl's desperate gamble was becoming something larger, a method, a practice, a way of surviving that anyone could learn. Marit stood by Toliff's grave on the first anniversary of his death, the hillside greening with new grass, the river below running clear and strong. "It is working," she said aloud. "The chambers are holding. The people are learning. Your teaching did not die with you." She stayed until the sun began to set. Then she walked back to her cabin, where Arno was waiting with iron fittings for the next build and a question in his eyes that she was almost ready to answer. The summer of 1889 brought the operation to full scale. Marit no longer worked alone. She had Arna for the ironwork, Ada for organizing the labor parties, and a rotating group of men and women who had learned the principles well enough to teach others. They built chambers across the settlement and beyond, stone-lined vaults that would keep fuel dry through any winter the territory could send. A typical build took 2 weeks with a full crew. Marit supervised the site selection and the drainage. Arna handled the metalwork. Ada coordinated the labor, assigning tasks based on skill and strength, making sure the work progressed in the correct sequence. The Solheim method, people called it. Marit did not like the name. It was Toliff's method as much as hers, and the physics belonged to no one, but she could not stop them from using it. By August, they had completed 14 chambers. By September, 21. By the first frost of October, 29 families in and around Medora had underground fuel storage that met Marit's specifications. She kept a ledger, not of money. She still did not charge for the knowledge, but of chambers. Each entry recorded the family name, the location, the dimensions, the date of completion. She noted which builds had required corrections after inspection and which had been perfect from the start. She tracked which principles people struggled with most, drainage, always drainage, and which they grasped quickly, the batter of the stone, once they understood the physics. The ledger was her proof, not proof that she had been right, that had been established 2 winters ago, but proof that the knowledge was spreading, that people were learning, that the thing she had built was becoming larger than herself. On the anniversary of her father's death, she visited his grave on the hillside above the claim. The wooden marker had weathered, but the words were still legible. Peter Solheim, 1843 to 1886. 29 chambers, she told him. 29 families who will not freeze because of what you left me. The claim you could not finish. The cabin you could not seal. The debt you could not pay. She paused. I paid it. I finished it. I made it mean something. The wind moved across the grass. The sky stretched blue and endless above. She walked back to the claim, where Arno was waiting with a design for a new kind of loading chute, one that could be operated by a single person, freeing labor for other tasks. Show me, she said. He showed her. The teaching had become routine, but it never became easy. Every new builder made different mistakes. Some dug too shallow, some selected stone that was too round to stack properly. Some rushed the drainage bed, eager to start the walls before the foundation was ready. Marit corrected them all. She developed a method for the teaching itself, a sequence that she followed with every new builder, whether they were experienced laborers or complete novices. First, she took them into her own chamber. She let them feel the walls, the floor, the air. She showed them the drainage by pouring water and watching it vanish. She demonstrated the vent with smoke. She made them understand through their hands and eyes and lungs what a properly built chamber looked and felt like. This is what you are trying to achieve, she told them. Remember this feeling. When you are building your own chamber, ask yourself, does this feel right? If it does not, stop and find out why. Second, she walked their site before they dug a single spadeful. She checked the slope, the drainage patterns, the distance from seep lines. She rejected sites that would flood and explained why. She approved sites that would stay dry and explained that too. The earth wants to give you water, she told them. Your job is to make sure the water has somewhere to go that is not inside your chamber. Third, she supervised the drainage bed personally. This was the step that failed most often when she was not present. People wanted to skip ahead to the walls, which looked impressive, rather than spend days laying gravel and ash that would be invisible once the floor was packed. Drainage before walls, she said over and over. If the drainage fails, nothing else matters. You can have perfect walls, perfect stone, perfect batter, and it will all fill with water and collapse if the foundation cannot carry the moisture away. Fourth, she checked the first course of stone. If it was laid correctly, battered, fitted, chinked, the rest would follow. If it was wrong, she made them tear it out and start again. This was the step that created the most resentment, but it was also the step that prevented the most failures. See, a wall stands because the weight knows where to go, she told them, using Toliff's words. Every stone carries the weight to the stone below it. The bottom stones carry everything. If the bottom is wrong, the top cannot be right. By the time a builder completed their first chamber under her supervision, they understood the principles well enough to build a second one without her, and many of them did. The knowledge spread from person to person, each new builder becoming a potential teacher. This was what Marit had wanted, not dependence on her, but competence in others. Not a method that only she could execute, but a practice that anyone could learn. Elias Rook returned to Medora in the autumn of 1889. He came back poorer than he had left. The Bismarck venture had failed, bad investments, unpaid debts, a fire that destroyed his warehouse. He had nothing now except the clothes on his back and a letter of credit from a bank that would extend him just enough rope to hang himself. Marit heard about his return from Ada, who heard it from the freighters who had seen him step off the stage. "He is staying at the boarding house," Ada said. "He has been asking about the chambers, about who built them, who paid for them, who profits from them. No one profits from them. The knowledge is free." That is what confuses him. He cannot understand how something valuable can be given away. Then he does not understand value. No, he does not. But he is still dangerous. He still has credit. He still has connections. And he still blames you for his failure. Marit considered this. Rook had been her enemy for 3 years. He had tried to take her claim, undermine her method, destroy her reputation. He had failed at all of it. But Ada was right. Failure did not always make men surrender. Sometimes it made them desperate. "What does he want?" Marit asked. "I do not know, but I think you should find out before he finds you." She found him at the boarding house, sitting alone at a table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He looked older than she remembered. The thick shoulders had sagged. The calculating eyes had dulled. He was a man who had gambled everything and lost. He looked up when she approached. Something flickered in his face, surprise, perhaps, or resentment, but he did not stand. "Miss Solheim," he said, "I wondered when you would come. You have been asking about the chambers." "I have been asking about many things. The chambers are the most interesting." She sat down across from him without being invited. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know how you did it." He leaned forward, and for a moment the old sharpness returned to his eyes. "I want to know how you took an idea that should have failed and turned it into something that spread across the territory. I want to know why people trust you when they never trusted me. You want to copy it. I want to understand it. They are not the same thing." Rook's jaw tightened. "I am not here to fight with you. I am here because I have nothing left, and I need to build something new. You built something from nothing. I want to know how." Marit studied him. She had hated this man for 3 years. He had threatened her claim, mocked her method, profited from others' desperation. He had represented everything she despised about the frontier, the predatory calculation, the exploitation of weakness, the belief that survival was a competition to be won rather than a challenge to be shared. But he was also a man who had lost everything, and she knew what that felt like. "The chambers work because they follow principles," she said. "Physics, engineering, the behavior of water and stone and earth. I did not invent those principles. I learned them from others who learned them from others." "And the spreading? The teaching?" "I gave the knowledge away. I did not charge for it. I did not control who learned it. I made sure everyone who built a chamber understood the principles well enough to teach someone else." "That is madness. You could have charged. You could have controlled the supply. You could have profited. Yes, like you did." Marit leaned back in her chair. "And people would have resented me the way they resented you. They would have paid because they had no choice, not because they trusted me. When I left or died, the knowledge would have left with me. And now? Now 30 families know how to build these chambers. They can teach others. The knowledge will survive me. It will spread without me. That is the difference between profit and legacy." Rook was silent for a long time. The coffee sat untouched between them. "I do not know how to do what you did," he said finally. "I do not know how to give things away." "Then learn, or do not. The choice is yours." She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "There is a family 2 miles east of here, the Larsons. They want to build a chamber, but they cannot afford the ironwork. If you want to help, you could pay for the fittings. Arne Nesheim at the smithy will know what they need." "Why would I do that?" "Because it would help someone who needs help, and because it might teach you something about value that you never learned from profit." She walked out into the autumn air. Behind her, Rook sat alone with his cold coffee and his ruined ambitions. She did not expect him to change, but she had offered him the chance. He paid for the Larson fittings. Marit heard about it from Arne, who delivered the news with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. Rook had come to the smithy, asked what the Larsons needed, and paid in full without negotiating the price. He did not ask for anything in return, Arne said. He did not ask for credit or recognition. He simply paid. What did he say? He said he was learning something about value. Marit did not know whether to believe that Rook had changed or whether this was the first move in another scheme, but she decided it did not matter. The Larsons would have their chamber. The knowledge would spread by one more family. If Rook's motives were pure, then good. If they were not, then he would fail again because the method did not require him. Over the following months, Rook paid for 6 more builds. He never asked for credit. He never attached conditions. He simply appeared at the smithy, paid for whatever fittings were needed, and disappeared. The settlement did not know what to make of him. The man who had once profited from desperation was now funding its opposite. Some thought it was guilt. Some thought it was strategy. Some thought he had simply gone mad. Marit thought it was something simpler. He had lost everything, and in losing everything, he had been forced to reconsider what mattered. The chambers worked. The knowledge spread. He could fight against that current or swim with it. He had chosen to swim. By the spring of 1890, Rook had funded 14 chambers. He still lived at the boarding house. He still had little money, but the settlement's attitude toward him had shifted, not to trust exactly, but to something like tolerance. When Marit saw him on the street, she nodded. He nodded back. It was not forgiveness, but it was enough. The proposal came in June of 1890, though it did not look like a proposal at the time. Arne had been working on a new design, a chamber that could be built into a hillside rather than dug vertically, using the natural slope for drainage and the Earth's own insulation for temperature control. It was an improvement on the Solheim method, and he wanted Marit's opinion before he built a prototype. They walked the site together, a south-facing slope above the river, where the soil was stable and the drainage natural. Arne showed her where the walls would go, where the entrance would be cut, where the vent would emerge on the uphill side. The batter will be different, he said. The earth presses from behind rather than from all sides. The walls must lean into the hill, not away from it. Like a retaining wall. Yes, but with a chamber behind it rather than fill. She studied the slope, imagining the finished structure. It would be larger than the vertical chambers, room for a full winter's supply, perhaps more. It would be easier to load because the entrance could be at ground level rather than through a hatch, and it would be more stable because the hillside itself would support the roof. It is a good design, she said, better than mine. It is not better. It is different, for different terrain, for different needs. You have thought about this carefully. I have thought about many things carefully. He paused. The wind moved across the grass, and the river below them glittered in the June sunlight. I have thought about this work, about building chambers that will outlast us, about spreading knowledge that will help people we will never meet. That's what we do. That's what we do together. He turned to face her. I would like to keep doing it for as long as I can, and I would like... He stopped, started again. I am not good with words. I have said that before. You have. But I want you to know that working with you, building with you, it is the best thing I have done, and I do not want it to end. Marit looked at him, at his scarred hands and his quiet eyes, and the way he stood, patient and uncertain, waiting for her answer to a question he had not quite asked. Are you asking me to marry you? I am asking if you would consider it. If the idea is not... He shook his head. I am doing this badly. You are doing it honestly. That is more important. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused from the forge, rough against her own calloused palms. They stood on the hillside above the river, two people who had built something together and were considering whether to build something more. Yes, she said, I would consider it. His face changed. Not dramatically. Arne was not a dramatic man, but the tension left his shoulders and something like joy crept into his eyes. Consider, or yes. The answer is yes. He pulled her close and held her, and she let herself be held, feeling the warmth of his body against hers, the steadiness of his arms, the promise of a future that she had not allowed herself to imagine. They stayed on the hillside until the sun began to set. Then they walked back to the settlement together, their hands still linked, to tell Ada and the others what they had decided. They married in September of 1890, in a ceremony witnessed by half the settlement. Jonas Hägglund stood as a witness. The man who had once told Marit she would freeze and lie had become one of her strongest supporters. Ada Keen brought flowers from her garden. The widow Rasmussen baked bread for the celebration. Even Karl Hoffman, whose collapsed chamber had once threatened to turn the settlement against Marit, raised a glass to the couple. Elias Rook attended but did not speak. He stood at the back of the gathering, watched the vows exchanged, and left before the dancing began. Marit noticed him leaving. She almost called out, but there was nothing more to say between them. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. The past was the past. The future was beginning. The years compressed the way years do when they are full of purpose. 1891 brought their first child, a boy they named Peter, after Marit's father. He had Arne's quiet temperament and Marit's observant eyes, and from the time he could walk, he followed them to the build sites, watching the work with a concentration that suggested he would one day continue it. 1893 brought their daughter Ragna, named for Marit's mother. She was louder than her brother, more demanding, with a laugh that could fill a room. She showed no interest in chambers or drainage or the batter of stone, and Marit loved her for it. 1895 brought the hardest winter since '86. The temperature dropped to 43 below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks. Drifts buried buildings to the roof lines. The road to Dickinson vanished entirely. The chambers held, every one of them. All 64 that had been built across the settlement and beyond. Not a single flood, not a single collapse, not a single family that ran out of fuel. The method had been tested by the worst the territory could deliver, and it had passed. After the thaw, letters arrived from Montana, from Wyoming, from the Canadian territories to the north. People wanted to know the Solheim method. They wanted drawings, specifications, principles. They wanted to learn what Marit had learned and build what she had built. She sent everything she had. She wrote the principles in letters that took days to compose, explaining each step the way Toliff had explained them to her. She drew diagrams. She described failures and how to avoid them. She gave away the knowledge as freely as she had given it in Medora, because the knowledge was not hers to keep. It had come from Toliff, and from her mother, and from the earth itself. It belonged to anyone who needed it. By the turn of the century, there were chambers in 3 territories. By 1910, the method had spread to Minnesota, to Wisconsin, to the Dakotas north and south. The name changed. In some places it was called the Norwegian cellar. In others, the Winter Vault. In others, simply the root cellar modified, but the principles remained the same. Drainage before walls, battered stone, cross-stack for airflow. A wall stands because the weight knows where to go. Marit grew old on the claim her father had left her. The cabin had been replaced twice, first with a proper frame house in '92, then with a larger structure in 1900 when the children needed more room. But the original chamber remained, maintained and improved over the decades, still dry, still functional, still holding fuel through every winter. People came to see it the way pilgrims came to see holy sites. They descended the passage and touched the walls Marit had laid as a desperate girl of 16, feeling the batter of the stone, the fitted joints, the work that had saved her life. She showed them all. She told the story so many times that it became worn smooth, the words automatic, the details polished by repetition. But she never tired of telling it, because every telling was an opportunity to teach the principles, to pass on what Toliff had given her, to ensure that the knowledge would survive her. Arne died in 1924, his heart giving out on a spring morning while he was working in the smithy. Marit found him slumped over the anvil, his hands still holding the tongs, a vent collar half finished beside him. She buried him on the hillside next to Toliff, next to her father, next to her mother, whose grave was far away in Wisconsin, but whose presence she felt every time she descended into a chamber she had built. She did not stop working. She supervised builds until her eyes could not see the stone clearly and her hands could not feel the fit of the joints. Then she taught from memory, describing what she could no longer see, trusting her students to carry out what she could only explain. She died in 1931, at the age of 61, in the frame house that had replaced her father's cabin. Her son Peter was with her, and her daughter Ragna, and 3 grandchildren who had grown up hearing stories about the winter of '86. Her last words were to Peter, who had built more chambers than anyone except his mother. "Check the drainage," she said. "Always check the drainage first." He promised he would. On November 9th, 1886, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours, and the snow came down like the end of the world. Jonas Hegland had stood on the Solheim claim that summer and looked at a 16-year-old girl with blistered hands and told her the truth as he understood it. "When the drifts seal your door," he said, "you will freeze first. Then you will have plenty of time to lie about how it happened." He was wrong. The drifts sealed every door in the settlement that winter. They buried every woodpile, froze every stream, killed every animal that could not find shelter. Men who had survived 11 Dakota winters ran out of fuel and burned their furniture. Widows rationed heat until their children turned blue. The cold found every gap in every wall and pressed through without mercy. But on the Solheim claim, a girl lifted a hatch, descended into darkness, and emerged with dry wood that had never felt the storm. The chamber she built held for 45 years. The principles she taught spread to 3 territories and beyond. The knowledge she gave away freely, without payment, without condition, kept thousands of families alive through winters that would have killed them otherwise. Outside, the winter buried every pile they trusted. Inside, Marit Solheim opened the one they had laughed at,